Hello, I'm AF Mixon, and on behalf of the English department, we'd like to introduce you to the 2023 recipient of the Hall Waters Prize, Terrance Hayes. Professor Hayes recently visited Troy and sat down with two students, Ashley Adams and Joshua Windus, to discuss his work and the state of poetry.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Ashley Adams and this is
Joshua Windus.
And we are here with
Terrance Hayes.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming. We are here to ask you some questions.
Sure.
So I'm just going to jump right in with my first one. Professor Hayes, can you tell us when in your life you discovered poetry and specifically how your experience with Cave Canem in the mid-1990s inspired you?
Two interesting questions. When I discovered poetry is maybe sixth grade, just being able to write it in an English class, but not really thinking of it as a career. Sort of like, when did you discover apple pie? You know, you just remembered at some point it being a thing you didn't want to stop doing. But certainly years later, by the time I was in my 20s, when I had an experience with this organization started by my professor at the time, Toy Darracott, and another poet professor, Cornelius Eady. They started this organization called Cave Canem. At the time, there were about 30 students who were involved with it. Now it's maybe the whole student body is probably about 500 people, but there were about 30 people. I was there, but I was mostly as a kind of gopher. I was there making copies and running errands for people. So I still think of my career being one where I like to drift in that space between the teacher and the student, or the helper and the leader, and maybe even at the fringes of circles in general. So that was my earliest experience, and that was how it was formative. I just decided I never wanted to be in one room, not the room of experimental, not the room of national, not the room of free verse, not the room of only telling stories, but sort of walking through a big house of poetry, sticking my nose in, standing for a minute and moving. So that would be how it influenced me, just opening up the world of poetry.
Amazing.
Oh, cool. So, could you tell us a little bit about the poetry market? Do you come up with a title first and then come up with a collection of poems that match that? Or do you come up with a collection of poems and then try to figure out the title?
So, you know, my real answer on that would be, when my mother talks about what I do to her friends, the preacher, she says, my son is a professor. And so if I think of my vocation as being teaching poetry and talking to people about poetry, I don't have to think about the market in that way. I prefer not to think of it as a thing that I have to sort of sell books to keep going. I have friends who make livings exclusively on their poetry, and I think they do fine. I just rather, maybe that's where my experimentation comes from, is that I don't have to think about who's going to buy it or who's going to understand it. I feel like if I have a handful of people who are interested, that's okay. I think I've been told I'm the leading seller at my publisher for contemporary poetry, but I just try not to think about that. And similar to the way I think about prizes, I mostly am interested in the things that will generate the work. So anything in the marketplace that makes me write the next poem, which is not that much, but this, talking to you guys, traveling around, being stimulated by environments, those are the things that I do think of as like integral to writing poetry.
Even when you have to deal with bad peanuts on a plane.
Really, it's the bathroom on the plane that I can't fit into.
I see.
You know, I'll say that too. Because of my relationship to that, I try to travel maybe once. I do like hotels, so for the last 20 or 30 years, I've taken at least one poetry gig a month. Sometimes more. Black History Month, I travel a little bit more. National Poetry Month. But generally, that one time a month, I take it as a vacation. Like, this is really my day off. I did something last week on a Sunday, and my friends were like, "You working on a Sunday?" But I'm like, "It's poetry. That's not work," you know. So I do think of it as all of it's great, even if getting there can be a challenge sometimes.
Yes, sir.
So have you thought of any ideas for poems while you're here?
Have I? Something did occur to me, and now I can't remember what it was. But yeah, there's been a few things.
Did it have
Somebody
to do with the color red?
With the color red?
Yeah.
No. You know what though? You just said it. It was the dirt. The dirt in South Carolina is slightly oranger. It's like the Piedmont dirt. It's oxidation. So through Georgia, it's a little bit orange. Here, it's a little bit browner. So I was just thinking about blood in the dirt mixing with things to get that color to be not quite as intense. So, you know, maybe that'll show up somewhere. But it's primarily just about the dirt and how great it is, you know. So, yeah, maybe.
Okay. This is my favorite question. Okay. As a Greek mythology lover myself, I noticed that you mentioned the mythological figure Orpheus in your 2006 poetry collection, Wind in a Box, and you even have a poem titled Cocktails with Orpheus. Can you please explain your connection to Orpheus and how you see classical mythology in general as a resource for your poetry?
Really good question. You know why? Because so Orpheus is the king prince of poets, so he shows up across everybody's work. There's certain poets that are like that, certain figures in mythology that are like that. Certainly Orpheus is a big one for references. So for a long time, I have, even in my first book, I have a poem called Noir Orpheus. He does show up. But in this last book, as I was thinking about Orpheus, I thought about this poem by another poet, I can't remember the name of the poet now, who has a poem about Eurydice, which is who, if you know the story, Orpheus, there's a bunch of stories about Orpheus, but one of the main ones is that he goes to the underworld to rescue Eurydice, and on the way coming back from the underworld, he's been told not to look, that she's behind him, and have that faith. And just as they're getting to the entrance out of the underworld, he looks over his shoulder, and then she's sucked back into the darkness. And I have been thinking that maybe Eurydice is a poet, you know, historically through mythology, he is a figure, he goes and he has these adventures, he's heartbroken because he's lost his beloved and almost had her, but I'm like, she's the one who goes back to the darkness, she's going back to the desk, and she's the one who has to kind of rely on her imagination as opposed to his adventures on the Isle of Lesbos and all other things that happen for him after that. So I'm suggesting, like, even one kind of primary idea for a poet, it's nice to have another angle on that sometimes. So one of the things that shows up in that book is suggesting that maybe it's not Orpheus who is the poet, but Eurydice, the woman, the beloved, the muse, as she's sort of given to us in mythology. So hopefully a poem can do that. I can sort of, it gives me an opportunity to say this to you, like, maybe it's not Orpheus, it is Eurydice.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
So I noticed there's a lot of just musical influences in your work. It's just undeniably there. And then there's also a lot of classical influences. And I was wondering, is it difficult to tie in all those different influences together, or does it just come just kind of naturally?
When I applied to graduate school, as an undergrad, you know, I wrote what I wanted. So I wrote essays, I read a whole bunch of stuff. Not, you know, just as I said, I didn't think people had careers at it. Even then, I thought maybe I'd be a college professor. So again, this is what I have become, it's what I always wanted to be. Meanwhile, with the work that I was reading, I just sort of wrote as I read. So when I applied to graduate school, it was before it was online, they still had dot matrix, you know what this is, little dot matrix printers. And so I filled out the form and it said, what do you want to have your degree in? And I wrote creative writing. And they put me in poetry. But I sent them short stories, essays, and poems, and I think they thought, looking at everything, that maybe poetry is what I should do. And so again, I think that that's partially right. And I still try to think of my relationship to work as a poet who can absorb all those genres. So I still will write kind of a little micro story sometimes, or something that maybe will sound like a song sometimes, little mythologies, little memoir things. So I think of the poet as being able to absorb all those genres. Certainly true for music, so that I don't think of myself in one corner of the music store, but as someone who can absorb it all and pretend to be it all and write about it all. So I think that's why they put me in poetry, because it is, to me, the most absorbent of all of the literary genres. But I still will say to you, though, probably a master's in creative writing or a graduate degree in creative writing is more liberating than a degree just in one genre. And so nobody's changed yet. Nobody believes that yet. But if you let me be in charge, everybody would be getting the same creative writing degree, so everybody could be poets and all the other things they want to be.
Do you have a record player?
I do.
Okay, I thought so.
A record player, I got a bunch of speakers, I got a bunch of mobile things that I carry around in the bathroom, little portable speakers. I do try to keep music going. And it is, you know, depends on what the music is for the day. I did a thing for the Paris Review, and I sent them like soundtracks for occasions. So I have like a 12-minute James Brown song that I play in the morning. I have a song I play when I'm walking, stuff I play when I'm working. So I do think of it as like a atmosphere, in fact, easy way to get into a different zone. So it is always playing, yeah.
Yes, and I was looking on Amazon and I was looking at all kinds of record players. So.
Yeah, vinyl's back,
Yes, it is. Okay. Okay. So in your essay collection on Etheridge Night, To Float in the Space Between, you write specifically how, though it does contain biographical elements, it is not a but rather a collection of essays as speculative, motley, and adrift as Knight himself. Can you explain a little more why and how the life and work of Etheridge Night inspired you to write such a unique take on him?
Certainly. That even connects to what I was saying. I'm in undergrad. My freshman year in college. I have no one has seen my work, but I have shown my one professor, Dr. French, who was a Yankee and was down there because he raised horses and all kinds of crazy things. It was the 90s. I don't say his name now, so I shouldn't tell all of his proclivities. But he let me teach a couple of times when he wasn't in shape to teach. He's, rest in peace. So that was my first experience with these things. And so he was the first professor I showed just a few poems. And anytime someone like me would come to campus, he would have me meet him. So I met with this one guy in October. This is actually a crazy story I haven't told it in years. And so this guy was friends with Etheridge Knight. And I had read Etheridge Knight in my leisure time because he was a writer who had moved from Mississippi up to the Midwest. And he was a writer who seemed to be doing a lot of things. Sometimes he wrote haiku, sometimes he wrote these weird fable poems, sometimes he wrote political poems. And he had been in prison for 8 years. So my mother had been a prison guard, and a lot of my relatives had relationships with the prison system. So I thought that was someone I could connect with, really. And so I read him. I met this guy who happened to know him, and he said, over Christmas break, you should come and hang out with Etheridge Knight in Indiana. I think he had gotten out of prison at this point. And I thought about it, but I was like, this is in the book, I was like, I don't know if I can tell my parents that I'm going to meet this guy. And it so happened, I don't think I put this part in the book, during the time I had off for school, I had a basketball tournament, and we went to NYU. It's my first Christmas basketball tournament. I averaged 10 points a game. 10 points a game, and we won the trophy. And I was like, I think that's okay that I didn't go. I'll go see Etheridge Knight during my spring break. And then he passed away in March. So between that moment and that moment, so I'm back at NYU years later. When I published my first book, years after that, I found this guy. And all of that sort of is the arc. That Etheridge Knight book is dedicated to this guy, Fran Quinn, who was, again, he was me. He just came to a campus, a small school. They probably couldn't afford Etheridge Knight at the time. He was just, he didn't even have a whole book. He just had a sheath of poems. But we sat in his office, and he was like, I think something's here. You should meet some poets. And then he lost track of me for 10 years until I found him and said, you know what? I did it. I'm still doing it. And so yeah, and then another 10 or 20 years when that book came out, I dedicated it to him. So I don't know if that answers it, but I would say the connection initially with Etheridge Knight was that, again, he was someone who seemed to not be on anybody's team. He was a black arts poet, he was a prison poet, he was a blues poet, he was a Southern poet, he was a poet as a father, he was a poet who had addictions, so he just seemed to do whatever he wanted to do. And that's very hard to find. If you look at the canon, if you look at any poet's style, it's hard to find people who are truly, that's what I think of as experimental. Not that you're doing like, a poem with a picture in it, a poem with one word in it, but that you are experimenting across fields. And so that just felt like the way I wanted to be as a writer, as a creative writer. Yeah.
Thank you.
You have a lot of diverse influences in your work, and I'm kind of curious about how those inform your view of masculinity and how that's portrayed in your poetry.
I can give you a line from the sonnets. There's a line in one of the sonnets where it's like, Prince proves every man has a beautiful woman in him. So how you sort of manifest that is the idea that, like, part of being masculine is being in touch with your feminine side, which I think you have to be if you're going to be a poet. But I wouldn't be able to say that for myself. I would say it for someone like Prince, who I also would say connected to like variety. I think, Prince's capacity to be like falsetto and then like low sometimes, like that too seems useful for how we might think of masculinity or how we might think of being an artist. All the different hairstyles that he had over the course of his career, one way to think about character and personality. So I generally think of my interest in artists who aren't writers as still being really useful for how I think about writing. So Jay-Z is super important for like how business, Prince is important for this too, how you might be an artist inside a business. Michael Jordan is important for like, you do want to kill people. So I was like, I got to slay, I got to kill my audience. Like the kind of excellence requires a kind of like, mercilessness with the art. And so, I could think of across the genres. Picasso is a person like that. Jimi Hendrix is a person like that. Toni Morrison, James Baldwin. So I think I'm often thinking about just people who have a certain kind of liberty and freedom inside of their work, and then trying to just use that for my own craft.
Cool.
Okay, so Professor Hayes, you write on page 6 of American Sonnet from My Past and Future Assassin, inside me is a black-eyed animal bracing in a small stall. Do you still feel as though you're an animal trapped in a small space? Is your body that small stall, and has your mind freed you from confinement?
Again, good question. So I think about duality. I talked about this today on the stage, that sometimes I'm doing this gesture, and then, in the middle is where we are, but there's this position and then there's that position. So I do think of, in that poem even, I'm thinking about like where personality comes from. So part of that poem is sort of suggesting that my father is kind of a bull, very rooted. He's the black-eyed bull in the stall. And then my mother's sort of like a bird image. So she wants to fly, but she's sort of in this cage. And so I remember how that poem ends. Would you rather like be lifting off even if you were in a cage, or would you rather be rooted in the earth even if you were in a stall? And I think of, again, my personality is probably like that. Part of it is certainly like a bird, trying to always break free and get up high as I can. And then part of it is like wanting to be like a bull, down in the earth, being reliable and sort of stable. So that's really what that poem is exploring. And so I think that it connects to the poems themselves, but more so if I say sometimes like mini memoirs, but poetry allows it to be disguised in a certain kind of way. For me, that's what I think about. That's a poem to me about like the influence of my parents on my personality.
See, I read Wind in a Box, and you talked a lot about your childhood in that one.
Right.
So when I read The Black-Eyed Animal, I did picture your father as the bull and your mother as the bird. I saw that completely. But for you, I saw you as a horse.
Well, interesting. Yeah, people have said that too. But I'm thinking about, again, like whatever it is, what would be between a bird and a bull? I got to draw that up tonight. An animal that's part bird, part bull. But yeah, so I mean, I'm really saying something else. Like in between that space, there's zones for the muscularity of the horse, or the quietness of the cat, or the shyness of the cricket. The day I read a poem about the tree frog even. So I'm thinking about our relationship to like spirit creatures, but I will still say to you though, as I said today about like the 6 sides to any answer, every question has a 6-sided answer to it. Here too, I still would do this. Like I'm neither and both at the same time, and probably most of us are like that. We're neither and both our parents. We're denying certain parts of the way our parents have influenced us, but they're there nonetheless. So that would be probably right. So I wouldn't even say like firmly horse. Some days, Thursday I'm a horse, and on Fridays I'm a cat. It's that kind of thing. Yeah.
You mentioned frogs a lot. I wonder if it's that neither land or water aspect of frogs.
Yeah, I do like the frogs. See, now I'm going to tell my story, and if my mother ever sees it, she's like, "Are you still telling people that story?" I did have a Kermit the Frog doll, and I think if I had had that through my whole childhood, who knows if I would have been an artist. But I was 6, and my mom was 22 at the time, and I broke a vase that had something like that in it, and in her rage, she cut up my Kermit the Frog doll. And this doll I took everywhere. I took it in the tub. It was my primary toy. And so the thing I said about her being 22 is trying to give her a little bit of room for, what is it like to be 22-year-old with a 6-year-old son. So, but my dad